For years, the Gilded Age has been remembered as a glittering chapter in American history, a time of grand mansions, limitless ambition, and industrial triumph. Popular memory suggests it slowly dissolved, softened by reform, and replaced by modern sensibilities. But that version is comforting and wrong. The truth is far more unsettling. The Gilded Age did not gently give way to the 20th century. It imploded under its own weight, faster than anyone expected, and in ways its architects could not control. This era was built on the belief that growth could outrun consequence, that private fortunes could substitute for public stability, that wealth, once accumulated, would protect its holders from risk. For decades, these assumptions seemed validated. Railroads stretched across continents, cities rose almost overnight, fortunes multiplied faster than laws could restrain them. The men at the top believed they were witnessing permanence. What they were actually witnessing was acceleration toward collapse. Behind the marble facades and polished silverware, the system was already cracking. Financial markets were fragile, labor unrest was escalating, political legitimacy was eroding. The distance between those who controlled wealth and those who produced it had become too wide to sustain. When the pressure finally broke, it did not break gradually. It snapped. Banks failed without warning. Industries froze. Entire fortunes evaporated in days. The social order that had seemed unshakable suddenly looked improvised and dangerously thin. This is not a story about decline over generations. It is a story about speed, about how an economy built on imbalance can unravel faster than anyone believes possible, about how power, when concentrated too tightly, loses its ability to adapt, and about how societies often misunderstand collapse not because it is subtle, but because it contradicts the illusion of stability. In this documentary series, we will trace the Gilded Age from its peak to its sudden disintegration. We will examine the financial shocks, the labor uprisings, the political backlash, and the cultural reckoning that followed. We will see how fortunes that once dominated America vanished within a single lifetime, and how institutions were rebuilt not out of idealism, but necessity. Above all, we will confront the uncomfortable reality that the Gilded Age did not end when people stopped believing in it. It ended when it stopped functioning. If you want to understand how systems collapse, not in theory but in real time, how confidence evaporates, how power fractures, and how wealth can disappear almost overnight, this series is for you. Stay with us as we begin the first chapter of a collapse that reshaped America forever. At its height, the Gilded Age appeared unstoppable. By the late 19th century, the United States had transformed itself from a fractured post-Civil War nation into the world's fastest-growing industrial power. Steel output surpassed that of Europe. Railroads stitched together distant regions into a single economic organism. Oil, finance, and manufacturing created fortunes so large they defied historical comparison. To contemporaries, it did not feel like a fragile system. It felt like destiny. The men who dominated this era did not merely participate in the economy, they defined it. Industrialists controlled pricing, wages, transportation, and access to markets. Banks were not neutral intermediaries but extensions of private empires. Political influence followed capital with remarkable efficiency. Laws were shaped by those who could afford to shape them. Regulation was minimal not because it was unimagined, but because it was actively resisted. This concentration of power produced an illusion of control. When rail lines expanded, when factories multiplied, when profits rose year after year, it appeared to confirm the belief that scale itself ensured stability. Bigger companies seemed safer, larger fortunes seemed more secure. Growth was interpreted not as a phase, but as a permanent condition. Yet beneath this confidence lay structural weaknesses that few were willing to confront. The American economy of the Gilded Age was not diversified in the modern sense. It was heavily dependent on a handful of industries, all of which were deeply interconnected. Railroads relied on steel. Steel relied on coal. Banks financed them all, often using speculative capital borrowed against future earnings that had not yet been realized. Failure in one sector could ripple outward with alarming speed. Labor conditions added another layer of instability. Industrial expansion depended on an enormous workforce that was cheap, replaceable, and politically marginalized. Immigrants poured into cities, filling factories, mines, and rail yards. Wages were kept low to maximize profit margins. Safety standards were minimal. Injuries and deaths were treated as costs of doing business rather than systemic failures. This arrangement worked only as long as workers remained fragmented and desperate. But as cities grew denser and industries centralized, labor began to organize. Strikes became more frequent and more coordinated. Workers did not merely demand higher wages. They challenged the authority of employers to dictate every aspect of industrial life. Each strike was treated by elites not as a negotiation, but as a threat to order itself. The federal government's response revealed how closely aligned political power was with industrial capital. When strikes disrupted production, troops were deployed. Courts issued injunctions against labor leaders. Violence was often framed as necessary to preserve stability, even when that violence was directed at workers demanding basic protections. These confrontations did not resolve underlying tensions, they deepened them. At the same time, the financial system grew increasingly speculative. Banking was lightly regulated, and reserves were thin. Institutions routinely loaned money they did not have, assuming that continued growth would cover shortfalls. Investors chased returns with little concern for long-term viability. Stock prices rose not because companies were stable, but because optimism itself became a form of currency. This optimism was fragile. Confidence, once shaken, could reverse instantly, and when it did, there were few safeguards in place. There was no central bank to stabilize markets, no federal insurance to protect deposits, no coordinated mechanism to manage panic. The system relied on trust, and trust was concentrated in a small circle of powerful men. The first major collapse exposed how dangerous this reliance had become. When the Panic of 1893 struck, it did not unfold gradually. Railroads failed in rapid succession, unable to service their debts. Banks closed their doors without warning. Credit evaporated almost overnight. Businesses that depended on loans to meet payroll collapsed within weeks. Unemployment soared to levels previously unimagined in an industrial nation. For ordinary Americans, the shock was devastating. Savings disappeared, jobs vanished. Families who had believed themselves secure found themselves in breadlines. For the first time, the promise that industrial capitalism would steadily improve life for everyone rang hollow on a national scale. For elites, the panic was equally unsettling, though in different ways. Many lost enormous sums, but more troubling was the loss of narrative control. The idea that wealth equaled competence no longer held. The men who had claimed to manage the economy appeared unable to manage even their own institutions. The public began to question not just individual failures, but the legitimacy of the system itself. This questioning marked a turning point. The Gilded Age had always relied on public acceptance of inequality. Wealth disparities were justified as evidence of merit, innovation, and discipline. But mass unemployment and visible suffering undermined these justifications. If success was proof of virtue, what did widespread failure signify? Political movements quickly capitalized on this uncertainty. Populists demanded currency reform, regulation of railroads, and limits on corporate power. Reformers exposed corruption and exploitation through journalism that reached millions. The moral authority of industrial elites eroded faster than their financial dominance. What made this collapse so sudden was not just economic fragility, but social saturation. The system had pushed inequality, speculation, and labor exploitation to their limits. There was no buffer left. When growth slowed, there was nothing to absorb the shock. Even after markets partially recovered, the sense of permanence was gone. Each subsequent crisis reinforced the lesson that the old order was unstable. The Panic of 1907 would confirm it again, forcing emergency interventions that made clear how dependent the economy had become on ad hoc rescues rather than resilient institutions. By the early 20th century, the Gilded Age was already a contradiction. Its wealth remained visible, but its authority had collapsed. Mansions still stood, but their owners no longer dictated national destiny with the same confidence. Political power began shifting toward regulation, oversight, and public accountability, not because ideals had changed overnight, but because survival demanded it. The collapse of the Gilded Age was not a single event, but a rapid sequence of failures that exposed the system's core weakness. It had mistaken scale for strength and concentration for stability. It had assumed that wealth could insulate itself from consequence. When those assumptions failed, they failed quickly. This first chapter is not about nostalgia or excess. It is about warning signs ignored, about a society that believed itself too successful to fail, and about how the speed of collapse often shocks, not because it is unprecedented, but because it contradicts the stories we tell ourselves about progress. Long before the collapse became visible, the Gilded Age was already hollowing itself out from within. Its greatest vulnerability was not greed or extravagance, but dependency. The entire system depended on uninterrupted confidence. Confidence in markets, in banks, in industrial leadership, and in the idea that tomorrow would always be larger than today. Once that confidence fractured, there was no secondary structure to hold the weight. At the center of this fragility was the American banking system. Unlike European nations that had developed centralized financial institutions, the United States relied on a patchwork of private banks, trust companies, and informal agreements between powerful financiers. There was no central authority capable of injecting liquidity during a crisis, no standardized reserve requirements, no safety net for depositors. Banking operated less like a system and more like a gentleman's agreement among elites who assumed rational behavior would prevail. That assumption proved disastrous. Banks routinely lent far beyond their reserves, using deposits to fund speculative ventures in railroads, mining, land, and industrial expansion. These loans were often backed by little more than optimism. Railroads, in particular, became the backbone of speculative finance. They required enormous upfront investment and promised vast future returns, making them ideal vehicles for debt-fueled expansion. But they were also vulnerable to even minor disruptions in traffic, pricing, or demand. When railroads stumbled, the consequences rippled outward instantly. Banks that had extended credit to rail companies suddenly faced losses they could not absorb. Trust companies, which operated with even fewer safeguards, found themselves exposed to cascading defaults. Depositors, sensing danger, rushed to withdraw funds. Panic fed on itself, accelerating the collapse. What made these panics especially destructive was speed. Information traveled faster than ever before, thanks to telegraphs and newspapers. Rumors could spark bank runs within hours. A single failure could trigger dozens more, not because all institutions were insolvent, but because none could withstand mass withdrawal. The system did not collapse because everyone was wrong. It collapsed because everyone acted rationally at the same time. The human cost of this financial fragility was immediate and severe. Businesses that relied on short-term credit suddenly found themselves unable to operate. Payrolls went unpaid, factories shut their doors. Workers were dismissed with no notice and no compensation. In industrial cities, unemployment surged so rapidly that municipal governments were overwhelmed. This suffering exposed another illusion of the Gilded Age, that private charity could substitute for public responsibility. Industrialists had long argued that government intervention was unnecessary because wealthy individuals would address social needs through philanthropy. But charity was discretionary, uneven, and often symbolic. It could not feed millions or stabilize entire regions. When crisis hit, philanthropy proved incapable of responding at scale. As desperation spread, public patience wore thin. The distance between boardrooms and breadlines became a political fault line. Americans who had tolerated inequality during boom years now demanded accountability during collapse. The question was no longer whether wealth was deserved, but whether it was dangerous. Labor unrest intensified under these conditions. Strikes became more militant, not because workers suddenly radicalized, but because survival left little room for caution. A lost job could mean eviction, hunger, or worse. Employers responded with force, supported by courts and state governments that prioritized order over reform. Each confrontation hardened attitudes on both sides. These clashes revealed how thin the social contract had become. The Gilded Age had produced wealth without consensus. Prosperity had not been shared widely enough to generate loyalty when hardship arrived. Instead, it produced resentment and distrust that magnified every shock. Political institutions struggled to respond. Many lawmakers were financially tied to the industries they were supposed to regulate. Campaigns were funded by corporate interests. Legislative paralysis was common. Even when reform was discussed, it was often diluted beyond effectiveness. The state lacked both the tools and the will to intervene decisively. This vacuum allowed unelected power brokers to step in. Financiers with vast personal resources organized private rescues, coordinating emergency loans and market interventions. These efforts sometimes prevented total collapse, but they came at a cost. They made it clear that national stability depended not on institutions, but on individuals. The economy was being held together by improvisation. This realization was deeply unsettling. It undermined faith not just in markets, but in democracy itself. If the nation's survival depended on a handful of men acting behind closed doors, what did that say about public governance? Meanwhile, the cultural tone of the country shifted. Newspapers no longer celebrated industrial titans uncritically. Editorials questioned monopolies and unchecked speculation. Satire and political cartoons depicted financiers as reckless gamblers rather than visionary builders. The narrative of progress fractured into competing interpretations. Even within elite circles, confidence eroded. Fortunes that looked vast on paper proved illiquid in practice. Assets were tied up in land, factories, and infrastructure that could not be easily converted to cash. Taxes and maintenance costs mounted. Heirs inherited complexity rather than control. Wealth began to feel less like security and more like exposure. The Gilded Age had promised insulation from risk. What it delivered was concentration of risk. When systems failed, they failed everywhere at once. There were no fire breaks, no redundancies, no institutional shock absorbers. Collapse did not require catastrophe. It required hesitation. By the turn of the century, this reality could no longer be ignored. Each crisis chipped away at the legitimacy of laissez-faire ideology. Calls for regulation were no longer fringe demands. They were pragmatic responses to repeated failure. The idea that markets would self-correct without oversight had lost credibility. What replaced it was not immediate transformation, but a slow rethinking of responsibility. The state began to expand its role, not out of ideological conversion, but out of necessity. Stability required rules. Confidence required safeguards. Growth required trust beyond private agreements. The collapse of the Gilded Age was not merely economic, it was institutional. It exposed the danger of building a national economy on informal power and personal wealth. Once those pillars cracked, there was nothing beneath them. As financial confidence weakened, the social consequences of the Gilded Age moved from background tension to open rupture. What had once been framed as isolated labor disputes became a national pattern of confrontation. Factories, rail yards, mines, and docks turned into pressure points where economic collapse translated directly into human desperation. The industrial machine that had powered America's ascent now exposed how little margin for survival existed for those who kept it running. Urban life amplified this instability. Cities had grown faster than their infrastructure. Housing shortages forced families into overcrowded tenements where disease spread easily and privacy disappeared entirely. Sanitation lagged behind population growth. Clean water was not guaranteed. Fire hazards were constant. During prosperous years, these conditions were tolerated as temporary sacrifices in exchange for opportunity. During economic contraction, they became traps. When layoffs arrived, they arrived without warning. There were no unemployment benefits, no severance protections, no institutional safety nets. A job loss meant immediate crisis. Rent still had to be paid, food still had to be purchased. Families sold belongings, took in boarders, pulled children out of school, and exhausted every informal support system available. Once those were gone, there was nothing left. This reality reshaped labor activism. Workers were no longer negotiating from a position of relative stability. They were negotiating from the edge of collapse. Demands hardened, so did resistance. Employers interpreted strikes not as pleas for survival, but as threats to authority. The response was swift and uncompromising. Private security forces were deployed. State militias were mobilized. Federal troops intervened when disruptions threatened commerce. Violence escalated not because workers sought chaos, but because power refused concession. Each clash reinforced the perception that the state existed primarily to protect capital rather than citizens. These confrontations were widely reported. Newspapers carried images and accounts of armed troops facing unarmed workers, of families evicted from company housing, of strike leaders arrested under vague charges. The narrative of benevolent industrial leadership grew harder to sustain. Sympathy shifted, unevenly but unmistakably, toward those bearing the cost of instability. At the same time, rural America experienced its own reckoning. Farmers were deeply entangled in the same financial system that destabilized urban labor. Credit was essential for purchasing land, equipment, and seed. Falling crop prices and rising debt trapped many in cycles of dependency. When banks failed, rural communities lost access to credit entirely. Foreclosures followed. Land that had been worked for generations changed hands rapidly, often absorbed by distant investors. This convergence of urban and rural distress created political volatility. Movements that had once existed on the margins gained traction. Demands for currency reform, railroad regulation, and limits on corporate power were no longer abstract ideas. They were framed as survival strategies. The legitimacy of existing institutions eroded as they failed to respond meaningfully. The political system struggled under this pressure. Many elected officials were financially intertwined with the industries they were expected to regulate. Campaign financing blurred the line between governance and patronage. Legislative action lagged behind public need. When reforms were proposed, they were often weakened by compromise or stalled indefinitely. This paralysis intensified frustration. If markets could not self-correct and government would not intervene, where did responsibility lie? The answer increasingly pointed upward. Industrial leaders who had once been celebrated as national heroes were now scrutinized as architects of imbalance. Public discourse shifted accordingly. Speeches, editorials, and pamphlets questioned the morality of extreme wealth accumulation. The language of inevitability was replaced by the language of choice. Inequality was no longer framed as natural outcome, but as constructed condition. This reframing mattered. It transformed collapse from misfortune into accountability. Cultural institutions reflected this change. Literature, theater, and art depicted industrial life with growing skepticism. Characters modeled on financiers were portrayed as brittle, isolated, and morally compromised. The spectacle of wealth lost its aura. Excess became a liability rather than a symbol of success. Within elite households, anxiety replaced confidence. Many fortunes were tied to assets that could not be quickly liquidated. Railroads, factories, and real estate generated paper wealth but demanded constant cash flow. When markets tightened, maintaining these holdings became increasingly difficult. Taxes rose as municipalities sought revenue. Staff costs mounted. Properties built for permanence proved expensive to sustain. Heirs faced a different challenge than their predecessors. They inherited complexity rather than opportunity. The skills that had built fortunes did not always translate to preserving them. Some adapted, professionalizing management and embracing new financial norms. Others resisted change, clinging to traditions that no longer matched economic reality. The physical environment reflected this shift. Construction of grand private residences slowed, then stopped. Planned projects were abandoned mid-design. Existing mansions fell into disrepair or were sold under pressure. Neighborhoods that had once symbolized dominance began to look frozen in time, disconnected from a rapidly changing city. Meanwhile, reformers gained ground. Journalists documented corruption with increasing precision. Investigations exposed unsafe working conditions, price-fixing schemes, and political bribery. These revelations did not create collapse, but they accelerated public recognition of its causes. Information spread faster than institutional response. The idea that private virtue could compensate for public failure lost credibility. Philanthropy, once heralded as proof of moral responsibility, was increasingly criticized as insufficient and selective. Donations could not replace regulation. Libraries and museums could not stabilize wages or prevent bank failures. The gap between gesture and structure became obvious. International context further complicated matters. Other industrial nations faced similar pressures but had begun developing centralized banking systems, labor protections, and regulatory frameworks. Comparisons were inevitable. American exceptionalism lost some of its persuasive power when instability appeared self-inflicted. As the 20th century approached, the Gilded Age stood exposed as an unfinished experiment. Its architects had built extraordinary capacity for growth, but neglected resilience. The system had no mechanism to absorb shocks without transferring pain downward. When stress arrived, it cascaded. What made the collapse feel sudden was not its speed alone, but its visibility. Failure was no longer hidden behind abstraction. It appeared in closed factories, empty storefronts, and public demonstrations. It appeared in the anxiety of those who had once felt insulated. It appeared in the realization that wealth, without institutional support, could evaporate faster than it was created. This period did not mark the end of capitalism, but it did mark the end of unquestioned dominance. The belief that markets alone could govern society lost authority. The collapse forced a reckoning with the limits of privatized power. What followed was not immediate resolution, but transition. New ideas emerged not from optimism, but from exhaustion. Stability became more desirable than spectacle. Predictability mattered more than expansion. The culture began, slowly and unevenly, to value systems over individuals. The Gilded Age had promised mastery over uncertainty. Its collapse revealed the opposite. It showed how fragile systems become when built without balance, how quickly confidence can unravel, and how deeply interconnected economic and social structures truly are. The consequences of this realization would reshape American life for decades to come. As the old order faltered, attention turned toward the mechanisms that had allowed such instability to persist for so long. At the center of that reckoning was the relationship between wealth and governance. During the height of the Gilded Age, political power had not merely been influenced by capital, it had been saturated by it. Corporate interests shaped legislation, judicial decisions, and enforcement priorities with remarkable consistency. This alignment was not hidden, it was normalized. Regulation was portrayed as interference. Oversight was framed as inefficiency. The language of freedom was used to defend concentration of power, even as that concentration narrowed opportunity for most Americans. For years, this framing succeeded because growth concealed its costs. Once collapse exposed those costs, the legitimacy of that language unraveled. The courts played a critical role in maintaining the old system. Judicial interpretations of property rights and contracts consistently favored corporations over labor. Injunctions were issued to break strikes. Union leaders were criminalized for organizing. The law functioned less as an impartial arbiter than as an enforcer of existing hierarchies. This imbalance further eroded trust in institutions meant to protect the public. Political parties struggled to adapt. Traditional alignments fractured as economic anxiety crossed regional and class boundaries. Voters who had once supported pro-business platforms began demanding intervention. Campaign rhetoric shifted, though policy often lagged behind. Reform-minded politicians faced resistance not only from opponents, but from entrenched interests within their own parties. As electoral pressure mounted, cracks appeared in the consensus that had sustained laissez-faire governance. Antitrust laws, long ignored or weakly enforced, gained renewed attention. Investigations targeted monopolistic practices that had been tolerated as efficient. Public hearings exposed coordination between corporations that undermined competition. The idea that scale alone justified dominance lost credibility. These efforts were uneven and contested. Reform did not arrive as a sweeping transformation, but as a series of confrontations. Each attempt to regulate was met with legal challenges, lobbying campaigns, and warnings of economic disaster. Yet the argument that regulation would destroy prosperity rang hollow in a system already failing. The cultural shift was just as significant as the political one. The archetype of the self-made titan lost its moral authority. Biographies that once celebrated conquest and accumulation were re-evaluated through a lens of consequence. The public began asking not how fortunes were built, but at whose expense. This change in narrative mattered because it altered what success itself meant. Education, too, reflected this transition. Universities that had been funded by industrial wealth began producing critiques of the very systems that supported them. Economists questioned assumptions about market equilibrium. Sociologists documented the social costs of inequality. These intellectual movements did not emerge in isolation. They were responses to lived experience. Meanwhile, cities continued to evolve under pressure. Municipal governments expanded services out of necessity. Public health initiatives addressed sanitation and disease. Housing reforms aimed, however imperfectly, to mitigate the worst conditions of urban life. These efforts marked a departure from reliance on private solutions. The state, once reluctant to intervene, found itself compelled to act. This expansion of public responsibility was controversial. Critics warned of inefficiency, corruption, and loss of individual initiative. But for many citizens, these risks seemed preferable to the certainty of collapse under the old system. Stability became the primary demand. Ideology became secondary. International events reinforced this shift. Global markets were increasingly interconnected. Financial shocks abroad influenced domestic conditions. The idea that any nation could insulate itself through private wealth alone appeared naive. Coordination, oversight, and planning gained legitimacy as tools of survival rather than threats to freedom. Within corporate circles, adaptation began quietly. Some firms embraced regulation as a way to stabilize markets and limit destructive competition. Standardization, transparency, and long-term planning became more attractive than speculative gains. This pragmatic turn did not reflect altruism, but recognition that unchecked volatility endangered everyone, including those at the top. Others resisted until forced to change. Legal battles dragged on. Public relations campaigns attempted to restore faith in corporate leadership, but the momentum had shifted. Each crisis weakened resistance. Each reform, however modest, redefined the boundaries of acceptable power. The transformation was generational. Those who had built fortunes in the unregulated environment of the 19th century often struggled to adjust. Their successors operated in a world where scrutiny was constant, and legitimacy had to be earned rather than assumed. Wealth alone was no longer sufficient protection. Physical spaces mirrored this evolution. Financial districts grew more formalized. Corporate headquarters replaced private mansions as symbols of power. Architecture emphasized efficiency and permanence rather than opulence. The aesthetic of excess gave way to the aesthetic of control. Yet this transition was incomplete and uneven. Inequality did not disappear. Exploitation did not end. What changed was the framework through which these issues were addressed. Collapse had forced recognition of systemic failure. Reform became a method of containment rather than transformation. The memory of sudden breakdown lingered. Policymakers, investors, and citizens alike understood that confidence was fragile. The lessons of the Gilded Age collapse informed decisions for decades, shaping responses to future crises. The belief that markets would always recover without intervention was permanently weakened. This period stands as a reminder that collapse does not require total failure. It requires enough instability to shatter trust. Once trust is gone, systems unravel rapidly, regardless of how impressive they appear from the outside. The Gilded Age fell not because wealth disappeared, but because belief did. Belief in inevitability, belief in insulation, belief that private power could substitute for public structure. When those beliefs collapsed, everything built upon them followed. What emerged was not utopia, but recalibration. A recognition that prosperity without balance invites disaster, that growth without restraint accelerates fragility, and that systems designed for expansion must also be designed for endurance. The consequences of ignoring these truths had already been made painfully clear. As reform slowly took shape, another consequence of collapse became increasingly visible: the transformation of wealth itself from a symbol of dominance into a source of vulnerability. During the height of the Gilded Age, fortune had been equated with control. To be wealthy was to be insulated, autonomous, and untouchable. But once instability set in, those same fortunes revealed an unexpected weakness. They were vast, but rigid, powerful, but difficult to move. Wealth that had once promised freedom now imposed obligation. Much of the era's capital was embedded in fixed assets. Railroads required constant maintenance. Factories demanded labor, fuel, and raw materials regardless of market conditions. Urban real estate carried taxes, staff costs, and upkeep that did not pause during downturns. These holdings could not simply be abandoned without consequence, yet they could not always generate sufficient cash to sustain themselves. Liquidity, not size, became the defining measure of survival. This shift exposed a fundamental mismatch between 19th century wealth and 20th century risk. The Gilded Age had rewarded accumulation over flexibility, expansion over resilience. When markets turned volatile, those priorities reversed. Smaller, more adaptable enterprises often fared better than sprawling empires burdened by debt and overhead. The mythology of bigness collapsed alongside financial confidence. Families that had dominated social and economic life felt this change acutely. Many were asset-rich but cash-poor, forced to sell properties, consolidate holdings, or restructure businesses simply to remain solvent. The sale of once iconic estates became common. Art collections were dispersed. Staff numbers were reduced. Public displays of wealth grew more restrained, not from humility, but necessity. This contraction altered social dynamics. The rigid hierarchies of the Gilded Age softened as old families lost their ability to dictate norms. New forms of status emerged, tied less to inherited grandeur and more to professional success, education, and institutional affiliation. The social map of power was being redrawn, unevenly but decisively. Philanthropy, too, evolved under pressure. Where it had once functioned as a demonstration of benevolence, it increasingly became a mechanism of adaptation. Foundations were established not only to fund causes, but to manage wealth more efficiently, protect assets from taxation, and extend influence within new regulatory frameworks. Charity became bureaucratic, institutionalized, and strategic. This transformation reflected a broader shift in how elites interacted with the state. Rather than opposing regulation outright, many sought to shape it. Influence moved from overt resistance to quiet negotiation. The goal was no longer to prevent oversight, but to participate in its design. Power adapted by embedding itself within emerging structures, rather than standing apart from them. At the same time, public expectations changed. Citizens no longer accepted instability as the cost of progress. The collapse had revealed how deeply economic systems affected everyday life. Demands for predictability, fairness, and protection gained legitimacy. These demands did not arise from ideology alone, but from lived memory of sudden loss. Media played a critical role in sustaining this awareness. Investigative journalism continued to expose failures, abuses, and unintended consequences of industrial capitalism. Public debate widened. Economic policy became a topic of common discussion rather than elite abstraction. The distance between expert discourse and public experience narrowed. Education expanded in response. Universities and technical schools grew, reflecting the need for trained professionals capable of managing complex systems. The emphasis shifted from entrepreneurial conquest to organizational competence. Expertise became a form of authority alongside capital. This professionalization extended into government. Regulatory agencies staffed by specialists replaced ad hoc responses to crisis. Standards were formalized. Data collection improved. While far from perfect, these changes marked a departure from reliance on personal networks and informal agreements. Stability increasingly depended on procedure rather than personality. Yet the memory of collapse remained close to the surface. Every downturn revived anxiety. Each financial tremor raised questions about whether old patterns might return. This collective memory influenced behavior, encouraging caution where exuberance had once reigned. The cultural imagination reflected this tension. Narratives of rise and fall replaced stories of limitless ascent. Literature and popular discourse emphasized fragility, consequence, and moral complexity. Success was portrayed as provisional rather than guaranteed. Failure became a central theme, not as individual flaw but systemic outcome. This reframing mattered because it reshaped national identity. The United States had long celebrated boundless opportunity. The collapse of the Gilded Age forced recognition that opportunity, without structure, could produce chaos as readily as prosperity. The myth of inevitable progress gave way to a more conditional understanding of growth. Economic policy evolved accordingly. Risk management gained prominence. Insurance systems expanded. Banking reforms sought to prevent panic rather than merely respond to it. These measures did not eliminate cycles, but they altered their intensity and visibility. Collapse, when it occurred, was more likely to be managed than uncontrolled. Still, the transformation was incomplete. Inequality persisted, sometimes widening under new forms. Regulation created winners and losers. Power did not disappear. It reorganized. The collapse had not democratized wealth, but it had disrupted its most extreme concentrations. The physical remnants of the Gilded Age stood as reminders of this shift. Mansions converted into institutions, private estates repurposed as public spaces. What had once symbolized exclusion now served collective functions. These transformations were not purely symbolic, they reflected practical adaptation to changing economic realities. As time passed, nostalgia softened memory. The excesses of the Gilded Age were romanticized even as their consequences were studied. This selective remembrance risked obscuring the speed and severity of collapse. The lesson was not simply that fortunes fall, but that systems built without resilience invite abrupt failure. The collapse had revealed that wealth alone could not guarantee continuity. Endurance required alignment between private ambition and public stability. Where that alignment failed, even the most impressive structures proved temporary. What endured was the framework shaped by crisis. Institutions designed to absorb shock, expectations grounded in caution, a recognition that unchecked concentration of power, whether economic or political, carries inherent risk. The Gilded Age did not vanish. Its influence persisted in architecture, culture, and memory. But its governing assumptions were dismantled by experience. The belief that expansion could replace balance was no longer tenable. The belief that private wealth could substitute for public responsibility had been disproven. The collapse forced a reckoning not only with economic systems, but with values. It raised questions about what kind of prosperity was sustainable and for whom. Those questions would continue to shape debates long after the era itself had passed. And they remain unresolved, resurfacing whenever growth accelerates faster than stability, whenever confidence outpaces capacity, whenever systems are built to rise but not to endure. As the memory of collapse settled into the national psyche, its influence began shaping decisions in ways that were subtle but enduring. The fear was no longer of poverty alone, but of sudden reversal. What haunted both elites and ordinary citizens was not gradual decline, but speed, the knowledge that stability could evaporate in weeks, even days. This awareness altered behavior across every layer of society. Financial caution became a cultural norm. Banks, pressured by reform and scarred by panic, became more conservative in their lending practices. Credit tightened. Speculation lost some of its glamour. While risk never disappeared, it was increasingly framed as something to be managed rather than embraced. The era of casual leverage gave way to an emphasis on reserves, audits, and transparency. For workers, the collapse reshaped expectations about loyalty and security. Employment was no longer assumed to be stable, regardless of tenure or skill. This uncertainty fostered new forms of collective organization. Labor unions, weakened by repression during earlier confrontations, regrouped with broader strategies. Rather than relying solely on strikes, they pursued legal recognition, political alliances, and public support. Survival required structure. The state responded unevenly, but directionally. Social policy expanded not from moral awakening, but from recognition of systemic risk. Destitution on a mass scale was no longer viewed as a private failure. It was understood as a destabilizing force. Public welfare measures, modest by later standards, emerged as tools of containment. They were designed less to eliminate hardship than to prevent unrest. Business culture adapted as well. Corporate governance became more formalized, boards of directors gained prominence, accounting standards improved. The myth of the singular genius gave way to the reality of coordinated management. Firms that survived were often those that embraced bureaucracy, not those that resisted it. This shift marked a profound change in how power was exercised. Authority moved from individuals to systems. Decisions became slower, but more predictable. Responsibility diffused across roles rather than resting with a single figure. While this reduced the likelihood of spectacular failure, it also diminished the aura of personal dominance that had defined the Gilded Age. Education reflected this transformation. Technical expertise and professional credentials gained value. Engineering, economics, and administration became pathways to influence. The romantic image of the self-taught industrialist faded as complexity demanded specialization. Knowledge became institutionalized. Cities continued to evolve under these new pressures. Urban planning gained legitimacy as a response to overcrowding and inefficiency. Zoning laws separated residential and industrial areas. Public transportation expanded. These developments were not purely altruistic. They were pragmatic responses to instability. Order reduced risk. The built environment embodied restraint. Architecture shifted away from overt displays of wealth toward functional permanence. Government buildings emphasized solidity. Corporate offices projected reliability rather than opulence. The aesthetics of excess gave way to the aesthetics of control. Yet beneath these adaptations, tensions persisted. Inequality remained deeply entrenched. The collapse had redistributed risk, not eliminated it. While some protections expanded, many Americans continued to live precariously. The difference was visibility. Suffering was no longer easily dismissed as individual failure. It was understood as structural vulnerability. This awareness fueled ongoing debate about the role of government and markets. There was no consensus, only compromise. Each reform provoked backlash. Each crisis tested the limits of intervention. The legacy of collapse ensured that arguments were framed not in abstract terms, but through the lens of experience. International developments reinforced this pragmatism. The global economy grew more interconnected. Events abroad reverberated domestically. The illusion of isolation dissolved. Coordination, once resisted, became necessary. Economic nationalism coexisted uneasily with global dependence. The shadow of the Gilded Age collapse also influenced cultural memory. Stories of sudden ruin circulated widely. Families preserved accounts of lost fortunes and vanished security. These narratives served as cautionary tales, shaping attitudes toward debt, investment, and ambition. Success was admired, but tempered by skepticism. Over time, nostalgia softened the edges of memory. The grandeur of the era was romanticized, its instability downplayed. Mansions became tourist attractions. Industrialists were recast as visionaries. This selective remembrance risked obscuring the central lesson, that collapse was not an anomaly, but a consequence of design. This forgetting was gradual, uneven, and incomplete. Each new generation rediscovered the past through its own anxieties. When growth accelerated, warnings resurfaced. When inequality widened, comparisons returned. The Gilded Age became a reference point, invoked whenever confidence seemed excessive. The true legacy of the collapse lay not in specific policies, but in altered expectations. The belief that systems must be prepared for failure became embedded, however imperfectly. Risk management entered the language of governance. Contingency planning became a norm rather than an exception. Yet the tension between expansion and restraint never fully resolved. Prosperity encouraged risk-taking. Stability bred complacency. The conditions that had produced collapse could re-emerge, reshaped but familiar. The lesson was not that failure could be prevented indefinitely, but that its impact could be mitigated. This recognition shaped the 20th century. Crises still occurred, but responses were faster, more coordinated. Institutions absorbed shocks that might once have triggered collapse. The memory of the Gilded Age informed these responses even when unacknowledged. The collapse had taught that confidence without foundation is fragile, that growth without balance accelerates risk, that power concentrated too tightly loses adaptability. These insights did not eliminate ambition. They constrained it. As the nation moved forward, the question was no longer whether prosperity could be achieved, but how it could be sustained. The answer remained contested. What endured was the understanding that stability is constructed, not assumed. The Gilded Age collapse was not an ending, but a threshold. It marked the moment when unchecked expansion gave way to managed complexity. The transformation was incomplete, imperfect, and ongoing. But it altered the trajectory of American life in ways that could not be undone. What followed was a world more cautious, more regulated, and more aware of its own fragility. A world shaped by the realization that systems built to rise must also be built to endure, or they will fall, quickly and without mercy. And that realization, born from sudden collapse, remains as relevant now as it was then. As the structures built in response to collapse took hold, a quieter but equally significant transformation unfolded beneath the surface. The psychological recalibration of ambition itself. The Gilded Age had trained Americans to associate success with scale, speed, and domination. Bigger enterprises were better. Faster growth was proof of genius. Competition was framed as conquest. After collapse, these assumptions no longer felt aspirational. They felt reckless. Entrepreneurs entering the new century operated in a different emotional climate. Opportunity still existed, but it carried an asterisk. Every expansion plan was shadowed by the memory of failure. Investors asked different questions. Not only how much profit could be generated, but how losses would be contained. Not only how quickly growth could occur, but how long it could be sustained. Risk did not disappear, but it became something to be justified rather than celebrated. This shift altered innovation itself. During the Gilded Age, invention was often chaotic and extractive, driven by rapid exploitation of resources and labor. In the aftermath, innovation became more incremental and system-oriented. Efficiency replaced spectacle. Reliability replaced audacity. The goal was not to overwhelm markets, but to integrate into them. Large corporations absorbed this lesson unevenly. Some collapsed under the weight of outdated assumptions. Others reinvented themselves by embracing long-term planning. Vertical integration gave way to diversification. Emergency reserves became standard practice. The language of permanence entered corporate strategy, even when permanence could never truly be guaranteed. Financial instruments also evolved. Where speculation had once dominated, new mechanisms emerged to spread and absorb risk. Insurance expanded into new sectors. Bonds became more standardized. Accounting practices improved not out of idealism, but because opacity had proven lethal. Investors demanded clarity after discovering how little they had understood before collapse. This growing emphasis on predictability reshaped consumer behavior as well. Households that had witnessed sudden ruin became cautious. Saving gained cultural prestige. Debt was approached with suspicion. Ownership was valued, but so was liquidity. The dream of immediate ascent gave way to a preference for slow accumulation. Yet this caution coexisted with lingering inequality. While the language of restraint spread, access to stability remained uneven. Wealthier households could absorb shocks more easily, even under new rules. For those closer to the margin, collapse remained a lived possibility rather than a historical memory. The system had changed, but not equally for everyone. This imbalance influenced political discourse. Reform movements splintered between those seeking systemic protection and those demanding redistribution. Compromise often favored stability over justice. The fear of renewed collapse made policymakers wary of drastic change. Incremental reform became the default approach, even when structural inequities persisted. Public trust in institutions recovered slowly. Each successful containment of crisis rebuilt confidence, but never fully. Skepticism lingered. Citizens learned to watch signals closely. Bank behavior, employment trends, political rhetoric. Confidence became conditional. Loyalty became transactional. This conditional trust altered civic engagement. Participation was driven less by optimism than vigilance. Voters paid attention to economic competence. Campaigns emphasized management rather than vision. Leaders were judged on their ability to prevent disaster more than their ability to promise greatness. Media reinforced this mindset. Coverage focused on warning signs, indicators, and forecasts. Economic reporting entered mainstream conversation. Numbers that once circulated only among specialists became household references. Awareness did not guarantee understanding, but it fostered attentiveness. Education systems responded by emphasizing practical skills. Financial literacy gained importance. Professional training expanded. The idea that success required not only talent but navigation of systems became widely accepted. Individual effort remained celebrated, but it was framed as insufficient without institutional support. Culturally, this era produced a quieter form of ambition. Achievement was no longer expected to be dramatic. Stability itself became aspirational. A secure job, a predictable income, a manageable future, these replaced the fevered dreams of limitless ascent. The collapse had narrowed the emotional range of hope. Architecture and urban design echoed this restraint. Cities favored infrastructure over ornament. Investment flowed into utilities, transportation, and public services. The goal was durability. Even private developments emphasized longevity over display. Materials were chosen for endurance. Design favored function. Still, the temptation of excess never vanished entirely. Periods of growth revived old instincts. Speculative bubbles formed, smaller and more controlled, but familiar in pattern. Each time, the memory of the Gilded Age collapse hovered in the background, invoked by critics and dismissed by optimists. This tension between memory and desire defined the era that followed. Prosperity encouraged forgetting. Stability bred confidence. Confidence edged toward complacency. The cycle did not repeat exactly, but its outlines were recognizable. What distinguished this period from the Gilded Age was not the absence of risk, but the presence of response mechanisms. When strain appeared, institutions intervened. When confidence wavered, safeguards activated. Collapse was no longer allowed to run unchecked, not because it was impossible, but because it was understood. Yet these mechanisms carried their own consequences. Intervention redistributed risk in new ways. Responsibility shifted upward, concentrating decision-making power within institutions. While this reduced volatility, it also created distance between outcomes and accountability. Power remained, but its shape changed. The public navigated this complexity with ambivalence. Gratitude for stability coexisted with suspicion of control. The collapse had taught that unchecked power was dangerous, but so was absence of power. The balance between freedom and security remained unresolved. Over time, the Gilded Age collapse became a reference point rather than a lived fear. Its lessons were institutionalized, then abstracted. The urgency faded. The story was taught, analyzed, and debated, but rarely felt. As memory softened, the conditions that enabled collapse began to reappear in altered form. Inequality widened again. Speculation regained appeal. Confidence outpaced caution. Each development echoed earlier patterns, though filtered through modern structures. The system had learned, but not transcended its nature. This continuity reveals the deeper truth of collapse. It is not a singular event confined to history. It is a process that emerges when systems prioritize expansion over resilience, efficiency over equity, confidence over preparation. The Gilded Age was one expression of this dynamic, not its final form. What made its collapse so instructive was clarity. The speed exposed design flaws that gradual decline might have hidden. The suddenness forced recognition. It stripped away narratives and left structure exposed. That exposure reshaped American expectations permanently. Even as memory fades, the architecture of response remains. Institutions exist because collapse once revealed their absence. Safeguards persist because vulnerability was once undeniable. The question that lingers is not whether collapse can be prevented forever, but whether its lessons will be remembered when prosperity returns. History suggests that memory competes poorly with ambition. The Gilded Age did not fade. It collapsed, and in doing so, it left behind a framework built not from idealism, but from fear, a system designed to endure failure rather than deny it. That framework has been tested repeatedly since. Each test raises the same unresolved tension. How much instability can a society tolerate in pursuit of growth, and how much control can it accept in exchange for security? The collapse offered no final answer. It offered a warning. And warnings, like memory itself, must be continually renewed or they are lost. As time passed, the collapse of the Gilded Age began to exert influence in a more indirect, but no less powerful way. It reshaped how Americans understood failure. Before the crash of confidence, failure had been framed as personal inadequacy. Those who fell behind were assumed to lack discipline, intelligence, or ambition. The collapse challenged that assumption by making failure widespread, sudden, and indiscriminate. When banks closed and industries froze, competence offered little protection. This shift mattered deeply. It destabilized the moral logic that had justified extreme inequality. If ruin could strike skilled managers, disciplined savers, and cautious investors alike, then success could no longer be interpreted purely as virtue. Outcomes were increasingly seen as contingent on systems rather than character. This realization did not erase individual responsibility, but it complicated it. Businesses absorbed this lesson unevenly. Some internalized the idea that resilience required redundancy and cooperation. Others doubled down on consolidation, seeking security through dominance rather than balance. The difference often determined survival. Firms that treated collapse as a systemic failure adapted. Those that dismissed it as an anomaly remained vulnerable. Insurance expanded dramatically during this period, reflecting a cultural acceptance that uncertainty was permanent rather than exceptional. Risk pooling replaced individual exposure. This change extended beyond finance into daily life. Fire insurance, health coverage, workplace liability all became mechanisms for managing instability collectively. The very existence of these systems was an acknowledgement that individuals could not bear risk alone. This collective approach subtly altered social values. Mutual dependence became more visible, even if rarely celebrated. The language of independence remained powerful, but practice told a different story. Modern life required coordination, trust, and shared safeguards. The collapse had revealed the limits of self-reliance in an interconnected economy. Government authority expanded within this context, though not without resistance. Each new safeguard raised fears of overreach. Each intervention provoked debate about autonomy, but the alternative, unchecked volatility had lost its appeal. The public tolerated greater oversight, not because it trusted power, but because it feared absence of structure more. This tolerance reshaped citizenship itself. Expectations of the state grew more complex. Citizens demanded competence rather than ideology. The measure of leadership became crisis management. Failure to prevent collapse carried greater political cost than failure to inspire. Economic language reflected this change. Terms like stability, confidence, and risk entered everyday vocabulary. Markets were no longer abstract forces. They were sources of anxiety and scrutiny. People watched indicators not as spectators, but as participants whose lives were directly affected. The workplace evolved accordingly. Long-term employment remained elusive for many, but expectations shifted toward predictability. Contracts became more formal. Labor protections expanded incrementally. While exploitation did not disappear, its most extreme forms faced greater resistance. The collapse had made exploitation visible as a systemic threat, not just a moral one. Education systems reinforced this pragmatism. Training emphasized adaptability. Students were prepared for uncertainty rather than guaranteed paths. The idea of a single lifelong trajectory lost credibility. Flexibility became a survival skill. Yet even as systems adapted, emotional memory faded. Those who had lived through collapse aged, new generations encountered its lessons secondhand through stories and institutions rather than experience. The urgency softened. Safeguards became taken for granted. Stability felt normal rather than hard-won. This normalization carried risk. When protections fade into background assumptions, vigilance weakens. Rules appear burdensome rather than protective. Constraints feel arbitrary rather than necessary. The conditions that enable collapse can quietly reassemble. Periods of prosperity accelerated this forgetting. Growth revived confidence. Innovation reignited ambition. Success stories dominated attention. Inequality widened again, reframed as evidence of opportunity rather than imbalance. The caution learned from collapse competed with the desire to believe it could not happen again. This tension surfaced repeatedly. Each expansion raised familiar questions. How much risk was acceptable? How much concentration was too much? How much instability could be absorbed? Answers shifted with circumstance, but the underlying dilemma remained unresolved. The legacy of the Gilded Age collapse persisted not as a fixed rulebook, but as a pattern of response. When confidence surged unchecked, critics invoked history. When markets faltered, institutions intervened. The cycle never disappeared, it was moderated. What distinguished the post-collapse world was not immunity, but awareness. Systems were designed with failure in mind. Contingency planning became standard. Stress testing replaced blind optimism. These practices reflected a deeper philosophical shift, acknowledgement of limits. This acknowledgement extended into cultural attitudes toward success. Achievement was admired, but tempered by skepticism. Sudden wealth inspired curiosity rather than reverence. Excess invited scrutiny. The moral certainty that had once surrounded fortune dissipated. Yet admiration did not vanish entirely. The allure of ascent remained powerful. Stories of triumph continued to inspire. The difference lay in framing. Success was increasingly depicted as precarious, contingent, and reversible. The collapse had stripped it of inevitability. This reframing influenced personal decision-making. People diversified careers, investments, and identities. Dependence on a single institution or employer felt risky. Redundancy became a form of security. Life planning incorporated uncertainty as a given rather than an exception. The built environment reflected this mindset. Infrastructure investments emphasized resilience. Systems were designed to fail safely rather than catastrophically. Redundancy was built into power grids, transportation networks, and supply chains. These choices carried costs, but collapse had taught the cost of omission. Still, the tension between efficiency and resilience persisted. Lean systems promised profit but sacrificed margin for error. Each technological advance revived debates about optimization versus safety. The lessons of collapse argued for restraint. The incentives of competition argued otherwise. This push and pull defined modern economic life. Stability required slack. Profit rewarded tight margins. The balance shifted constantly, influenced by memory, regulation, and circumstance. Collapse was never eliminated, only postponed or reshaped. The enduring impact of the Gilded Age collapse lay in its exposure of illusion. It revealed that prosperity without safeguards is fragile, that systems built for growth alone invite abrupt failure, that confidence, once lost, is difficult to restore. These insights did not produce permanent solutions. They produced frameworks, institutions that could adapt, policies that could respond, norms that discouraged extremes, at least temporarily. The collapse also left a quieter legacy: humility, a recognition, however imperfect, that complexity exceeds control, that no system, however powerful, is immune to its own design flaws. That certainty is often the most dangerous assumption of all. As decades passed, this humility waxed and waned. It resurfaced during crises, receded during booms. The Gilded Age collapse remained a reference point, invoked when warning was needed, ignored when optimism prevailed. This dynamic is not accidental. It reflects the nature of human systems. Memory competes with desire. Experience competes with ambition. The collapse offered clarity, but clarity fades. What remains constant is the underlying lesson. Systems do not collapse because people intend failure. They collapse because success obscures vulnerability, because growth disguises imbalance, because confidence delays correction. The Gilded Age embodied this pattern with unusual clarity. Its collapse was sudden because its assumptions were extreme. Its speed was a function of design. Understanding this is not about nostalgia or condemnation. It is about recognition. Recognition that collapse is not an aberration, but a possibility embedded within any system that prioritizes expansion over resilience. The legacy of that collapse continues to shape responses to uncertainty, even when unacknowledged. It lives in regulations, in institutions, in cultural caution. It is present whenever stability is valued over spectacle. Whether that legacy will endure depends on memory. And memory, as history shows, is fragile. The Gilded Age did not fade into the past. It collapsed, and in collapsing, it left behind a map of vulnerability. That map remains, waiting to be consulted or ignored each time confidence begins to outrun capacity once again. As the decades passed, the collapse of the Gilded Age quietly reshaped how Americans understood power itself. In the 19th century, power had been visible, concentrated, and personal. It lived in names, estates, and dynasties. It announced itself through architecture, patronage, and spectacle. After collapse, power did not disappear, but it changed form. It became less theatrical and more procedural, less embodied in individuals and more embedded in systems. This transformation altered how authority was exercised and perceived. During the height of the Gilded Age, decision-making often occurred behind closed doors, guided by personal relationships and informal agreements. Markets moved because influential men willed them to move. After collapse, this approach appeared dangerously fragile. Too much depended on trust between a few actors. When that trust failed, everything failed with it. The response was not to eliminate concentration of influence, but to disguise it within structure. Committees replaced individuals. Boards replaced patrons. Rules replaced favors. This shift created the appearance of neutrality and permanence. Decisions were framed as outcomes of process rather than preference. Power became harder to see, but no less consequential. This invisibility carried its own risks. When authority is diffuse, accountability becomes difficult to trace. Failures can be attributed to procedure rather than judgment. Responsibility dissolves into complexity. The collapse had exposed the danger of personal dominance, but the solution introduced a different vulnerability: bureaucratic distance. Public trust adapted accordingly. Confidence in charismatic leadership declined. Skepticism toward institutions increased, even as reliance on them grew. People learned to depend on systems they did not fully trust, because the alternative, unregulated volatility had proven worse. This ambivalence became a defining feature of modern civic life. Economic planning reflected this tension. Long-term forecasting gained prominence. Data collection expanded. Statistical models attempted to predict and manage uncertainty. These tools promised foresight, but they also created new illusions of control. Numbers replaced narratives. Risk was quantified, categorized, and ranked. Yet quantification did not eliminate surprise. it merely reframed it. When predictions failed, the shock was not just financial, but psychological. Each unexpected downturn revived the memory of sudden collapse. Each miscalculation raised questions about whether systems had truly learned from the past or simply grown more complex. The corporate world navigated this uncertainty through consolidation. Mergers were justified as stabilizing forces. Size was once again framed as security, but now under the language of efficiency and resilience. The same logic that had fueled the Gilded Age returned in moderated form. Bigger entities were assumed to be safer, not because of dominance, but because of diversification. This assumption held until it didn't. Large systems introduced their own fragilities. Interdependence meant that failure could spread quickly. Complexity made oversight difficult. The lessons of collapse had been partially absorbed, but not fully integrated. Old patterns resurfaced under new names. Workers experienced these shifts unevenly. While overt exploitation faced greater resistance, insecurity persisted. Employment became more formal but less personal. Job protections improved in some sectors while disappearing in others. Stability was offered conditionally, tied to performance metrics rather than loyalty. The promise of permanence was replaced by the promise of adaptability. This environment demanded constant adjustment. Individuals learned to navigate institutions rather than belong to them. Careers became sequences rather than trajectories. Identity itself grew more flexible, shaped by changing roles and affiliations. The collapse had taught that attachment to a single structure was risky. Community life reflected this mobility. Traditional networks weakened as people moved frequently in search of opportunity. New forms of association emerged, often professional rather than local. Belonging became functional. Support systems were built around shared interests rather than shared geography. The state attempted to compensate for this fragmentation by expanding social infrastructure. Public programs addressed gaps left by mobility and market volatility. These measures reduced extremes but did not eliminate precarity. They functioned as buffers, not guarantees. Cultural narratives adjusted accordingly. The heroic arc of singular achievement gave way to stories of navigation and endurance. Success was portrayed as the ability to manage uncertainty rather than conquer it. Failure was framed as interruption rather than disgrace. These narratives softened judgment but also normalized instability. Yet normalization carried danger. When instability becomes expected, its causes receive less scrutiny. Systems can fail repeatedly without provoking fundamental change. The collapse of the Gilded Age had once forced reckoning. Over time, repetition dulled urgency. Memory faded unevenly. Institutions remembered through policy. Individuals remembered through family stories. But as generations passed, collapse became abstraction. It was studied, referenced, and cited, but rarely felt. The emotional weight diminished. This distance allowed contradictions to re-emerge. Inequality expanded under new rationales. Concentration of power returned, framed as innovation. Speculation regained legitimacy, cloaked in technical sophistication. Confidence once again threatened to outrun capacity. The difference lay in response. When strain appeared, intervention followed more quickly. Collapse was anticipated, managed, and often postponed. This responsiveness created an illusion of mastery. Crises were survived, reinforcing belief in control. But survival is not resolution. Each intervention carried costs. Debt accumulated, complexity increased, moral hazard emerged. The system became adept at absorbing shock but less capable of reforming itself. This dynamic echoed the late Gilded Age in a quieter register. The warning signs were subtler. The language was more cautious. But the underlying tension between expansion and resilience persisted. The collapse of the Gilded Age had revealed that unchecked growth concentrates risk. The modern system dispersed risk, but also obscured it. Vulnerability became harder to locate, harder to confront. This obscurity influenced political debate. Responsibility was contested. Outcomes were attributed to global forces, technical constraints, or historical inevitability. Agency diffused. Change slowed. Citizens responded with skepticism and fatigue. Trust eroded not because of sudden failure, but because of persistent uncertainty. Confidence became provisional. Engagement became selective. The legacy of collapse thus evolved from warning to condition. It shaped expectations without dictating outcomes. It informed behavior without guaranteeing wisdom. It lingered as background noise rather than alarm. Yet its core lesson remained intact. Systems built without resilience will fail abruptly. The form of failure may change, but the pattern persists. Success amplifies vulnerability when it discourages correction. The Gilded Age collapse was dramatic because it stripped away illusion quickly. Modern systems often preserve illusion longer, distributing consequence over time. This can feel safer, but it can also delay reckoning. Understanding this distinction is essential. Collapse does not always arrive as a single event. It can unfold as accumulation, erosion, and deferred consequence. The speed may differ, but the cause remains familiar. The Gilded Age stands as a case study in extremes. Its collapse was sudden because its assumptions were absolute. It trusted growth completely. It dismissed balance entirely. When trust broke, nothing remained to stabilize the fall. What followed was adaptation, not immunity. Systems learned to survive, to collapse, not to prevent vulnerability. The difference matters. As history continues to unfold, the question is not whether collapse will recur, but how it will manifest, whether it will arrive loudly or quietly, whether it will provoke reform or resignation. The legacy of the Gilded Age collapse offers no comfort, but it offers clarity. It shows that stability is constructed deliberately or lost suddenly. That power, whether visible or hidden, must be constrained. That confidence without humility invites failure. These truths do not expire, they wait. They wait each time prosperity accelerates, each time inequality widens, each time systems are trusted simply because they have not yet failed. The Gilded Age did not fade, it collapsed. And its shadow continues to stretch forward, not as a warning shouted from the past, but as a pattern embedded in the present, subtle, persistent, and easy to ignore until it is no longer possible to do so.